So today we're going to talk about some research that both IBM and Red Hat have done over the course of the past year or so that demonstrates that open source really has sort of won the future of cloud in particular, but also AI and machine learning. And so each company has done independent research that we're each going to tell you about. So back in 1997, Eric Raymond, who authored the essay, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, wrote, "Perhaps in the end, the open source culture will triumph simply because the closed source world cannot win an evolutionary arms race with open source communities that can put orders of magnitude more skill time into a problem." And this is the essence of what open source is really all about. Open source, especially the way that I think IBM and Red Hat consider it, involves communities coming together to collaborate on the development of software that can be shared by all, whether they contributed or not. So when we think about that, what are the benefits of open source to software developers? Well, it really is, it translates essentially into improved skills, the ability to understand the underlying technology much better than you can with closed source, where you don't have access to the source code. But it also helps you with building your eminence. And so again, we get access to innovation. And again, if you take a look at the innovation that's going on in open source and contrast that with what's going on in the closed source world, open source is clearly winning. The other interesting thing about open source communities is that you have access to all of the developers that helped build the software in the first place, and you'll find that they're actually very willing to be engaged and to engage, answering questions, and even helping people onboard to become contributors to a project. And that's where you can essentially build your eminence in those communities. And this can translate into better job opportunities and advancement at your current place of work. Why does it matter to IBM? Well, essentially, it means that we can deliver better products, better performance in delivering those products, and that we can help build a strong workforce. Again, if you take a look at IBM's strategic offerings in cloud, data, and AI, almost all of them are comprised of a significant component of open source on which we build some closed source capability. But certainly when it comes to cloud, right, our cloud is based on Kubernetes and OpenShift, right? When you look at our data and AI capabilities, they're almost exclusively open source these days. And the interesting thing is that it really does help to attract and retain people with the skills that we want to deliver. So what did we do? So basically, at about this time last year, I was reading an article that that suggested that all developers need to understand, and I won't mention the vendor's name, but vendor X's cloud APIs. That's what's going to help you advance your career. And I thought to myself, well, that's not really true, is it? Because for all of the major cloud vendors, all the hyperscalers, the underlying technology for all of their capabilities is open source, right? Almost everybody's container orchestration capabilities are based on Kubernetes. And the thing that you need to really understand is the underlying Kubernetes APIs, not necessarily, the veneer that the various vendors put on top of it. And so I thought to myself, well, I wonder if we can do some studies to sort of prove out my thought that indeed it's the open source that underlies all of these capabilities that we all come to know and love, that are really the thing that developers need to know and want to know, and that they really think that it helps them improve their careers. So we took a survey of about 3,400 people. About half of them were developers, and the other were various flavors of DevOps, SREs, cloud engineers, managers, and so forth. The responses were pretty much consistent across all the industries and across all the different company sizes. And we sort of, broke it down based on the ratio that you see at the graphic below. But pretty much the answers are consistent across all of those dimensions. So the most important thing I think that we take away from this study that IBM did with O'Reilly was that the most beneficial skills for developers' careers are those of the underlying open source technologies behind cloud, AI, and data. And that only 35% of respondents felt that the most important skills were the proprietary vendor-specific cloud platform APIs. So I think that's an important takeaway. And then we also found, as we dig a little bit deeper into the survey that we conducted, is that almost 70% felt that they'd rather work with an open source based cloud platform than a proprietary one. 2/3 felt that having experience in open source is better for their long-term career prospects. And again, over 2/3 felt that involvement and contributions to open source projects often result in better professional opportunities for those respondents. They also felt that contributions to open source projects gave them more visibility within their workplace, and it also provided opportunities to do public speaking at conferences and webinars and meetups and so forth in the areas that they were specializing. So again, I think these are pretty critical aspects that address the points that I was making a little bit earlier about building your eminence, improving your stature at work, and understanding the underlying technologies for the cloud APIs and data and AI APIs that you're using in your workplace. When we break it down into, sort of which technologies, right? So Linux is clearly the winner here, with 80% saying that it's extremely important for their career advancement to understand Linux. And again, over 2/3 felt that you had to be a subject matter expert in Linux to get further in their jobs. And then almost 60% felt that it helped them obtain higher pay at their workplace and as they change jobs occasionally. Databases came in second, pardon me, with 70% thinking that it's very important to their careers to have a clear expertise in databases such as MySQL and MongoDB, MariaDB, and Postgres and so forth. With almost half saying that having subject matter expertise in with these open databases was critical to their careers. Containers came in just below open data. Again, containers, things like Docker and Containerd and so forth, came in at 68%, thinking that it's very important for their careers to have an understanding and knowledge of container capabilities. And then 31% felt that you had to be a subject matter expert. And I think this is because a lot of the tooling has been developed around containers such that you don't have to have deep knowledge of containers in order to use them effectively. Kubernetes came in next with just over 52%. And again, I think because it's, the way that it's delivered typically through a vendor-specific implementation of Kubernetes, something like OpenShift, for instance, that you don't have to have subject matter expertise in Kubernetes in order to use it effectively. But again, having that knowledge, 43% felt that it helped them obtain higher pay. And then AI came in with 32% thinking that it was important to their career. Now, again, this survey was not oriented towards data scientists, but clearly 32% of developers thinking that as things go forward, they're going to be much more integration, if you will, of AI and machine learning capabilities in traditional software development and software platforms. And so again, I think that number is going to continue to rise. And then, you think about most cloud offerings, and there's some sort of need for capabilities such as Istio, Envoy, and the like. And again, 13% felt that that was important. When we think about open source from the perspective of, the types of things that it offers, the number one, 85% felt that it minimized vendor lock-in. And this is pretty much true because really when you sort of jump from one cloud platform to the other, the fact that they're all based on the same underlying capabilities of Kubernetes and containers, you're going to find that basically, things are they're much more portable, I would say, between platforms. There's less of a vendor lock. I think the lower cost is a little bit deceptive. I think developers may think that, but they probably don't realize that that's because there's an awful lot of sweat equity that goes into deploying open source and keeping it up to date. Developers may not see that. It makes me think I'm part of a community. So again, one of the beauties of open source is that it's community driven for the most part. And when you are starting to take up a new technology, the best way is to engage with that community, to learn, to participate in meetups around that technology, to participate in the weekly meetings in the community, to participate in the mailing lists and the Slack channels and so forth is a really great way of engaging with that community and picking things up from the members of that community, building relationships with members of that community. It provides an incentive to innovate, right? And so, one of the benefits of open source is that you get to build on the shoulders of giants, right? You don't have to reinvent everything from scratch. You can take something and improve it. And through whether it's through forking or through making contributions into the project that help to improve it, you get to innovate without having to do the whole thing from soup to nuts. It makes my job more meaningful. So almost 2/3 felt that it made their job much more meaningful than participating in development with closed source capabilities. So again, these are the types of things that I think people normally associate with open source, but really to understand that 2/3 felt that it makes it more, it makes their job more meaningful. They felt that they're part of a community, that it's lower cost and minimizes vendor lock-in. I think all of those things are important to appreciate. Now comes the part of this survey that I was actually surprised by. So when we looked at this from the perspective of hiring managers, there were a few questions that we sprinkled into the survey that were focused on hiring managers. 87% of hiring managers consider that the applicant's knowledge of open source, they consider that as part of the equation to whether or not to hire that individual. And that's because, there's a sort of an adjacent survey that was done by the Linux Foundation that found that 93% of hiring managers are finding it difficult to find the right talent with the skills they're looking for. And that's up from 87%. So again, we're finding that, increasingly looking for people with that set of skills is important to hiring managers. And to understand, and I'll get to that actually on this next chart here, is then we're looking at, whether or not people felt, and this is again from the hiring manager perspective, whether or not people felt that using open source helped to attract talent, right? So if they were building an offering, building software, building a product or a solution around some underlying open source componentry, that 44% strongly agreed that using open source was an important factor in hiring. And then open source skills, whether or not they're an important factor, again, we found that 36, almost 37% agree, and then 14% agreeing completely. So, clearly far more than disagreed or didn't have any opinion. But the important thing to take away from this is that in both these questions that we put, the hiring managers were more likely to agree than the developers. So I think, again, developers are finding, hiring managers are finding that it's much more important to find people with those skills. So, again, if we just sort of put this into, what have we learned, right? A majority think that knowledge of and contributions to open source provide them with greater long-term value for their careers. Again, benefits to developers include the guarantees it offers against vendor lock and so forth. 2/3 of developers consider that skills related to the underlying open source are more beneficial to their careers. Linux, containers, open databases were the technologies that were most important to understand and appreciate to grow your skills. And then approximately 50% of developers consider that their knowledge in these technologies has resulted in higher pay. Now, as a result, and here's an access, you can get the survey, ibm.biz/O'Reilly-open-report. And you can get that from the charts a little bit later. But I would encourage you to read the full report. It was really quite interesting in terms of the findings that you'll see there. And what we did over the course of the next few months after the report came out is we thought, well, what if we were to put together a guide that helped developers get access to the right open source capabilities that were underpinning all of these clouds, so that they could essentially skill up in those open source technologies and sort of get on that gravy train towards better pay and so forth. And so we put together something we call the Open Source Cloud Guide, which is actually open source, right? So you can actually contribute to this to help improve it. We built it around a set of use cases for each sort of discipline, for each type of technology, and where we point you towards the underlying open source projects themselves, where we provide you with access to enablement to get onboarded into those technologies, and examples of how they're used and so forth. And we encourage and invite others to come and contribute towards this guide as we go forward. But we've put out sort of the starter guide, if you will, and we are really jazzed about the possibility that we're going to have some others come in and help us improve it over time. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deb.
All right, Chris, that was amazing. I couldn't help but think about where skills are being found today, and really excited that you've produced an open source guide to helping people get involved. Maybe we'll have some time to talk about that a little bit more at the end of our session. So I'm going to provide a different perspective on a lot of the same questions, and that is a survey that Red Hat did this last year with large customers, enterprise customers of open source. And Chris is going to drive my slides, so you'll hear me say next from time to time while we do that. So Chris, you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. So we had an independent company do this research. We didn't want to taint a response by anyone knowing that Red Hat was underwriting the report. We were very interested in a broad understanding of how companies, large companies, are using open source today, how they're thinking about it, what they're actually using, what their plans are. We had about 1,250 people surveyed from a number of companies. And this is now the 3rd edition of our report. You want to go to the next slide? For the folks that responded, 90% of them said that they use enterprise open source. And I just want to be clear, we use the expression enterprise open source in this particular report, but that's about the context for the questions being asked in enterprise. There is not a special flavor of open source. I will just be clear. I always harp on that. Open source is open source. We'll go to the next slide, Chris. So here's a summary of the top benefits. Higher quality software came in first. Access to latest innovations next. Better security, and the ability to safely leverage open source technology. Translated, that means increased ability to integrate into their environment, less likely to break something. This is an interesting transition over the last several years. We're starting to see less benefit of reduced costs and more benefits around the quality of the software, and in particular, more innovation. Those are the two of the bigger shifts. Can go to the next slide, Chris. Here's since we were talking about cloud, I wanted to put in a bit of information on cloud. This is on Kubernetes. 85% IT leaders say Kubernetes is important to their cloud native application strategy. Most of them thought it was extremely important or very important. Go to the next slide. 72% expected to increase their use of containers over the next year, fairly significantly. We're seeing more deployment. This particular report, by the way, also breaks out industry. We're not going to go into detail, but if you're interested in different vertical sectors, if you go read the full report that's available online, you'll be able to see more granularity in all these questions. Next slide, please, Chris. Here's the adoption slide. This is about doubled over the last 2 years. So far more in production, far more in development. Very few people still on the edges thinking about it. Most have already taken the plunge. Next, please. So the emerging technology space is something where we're seeing a tremendous amount of growth and expectation to grow. When you think about emerging tech, we're talking about IoT and edge computing, AI and ML. Emerging applications like self-driving cars will be built on open source and open standards. So the industry is really stepping up to leverage open source. Next, please. And here you can see a little bit more granularity. Edge computing, Internet of Things today, 55% of the respondents said they were already using open source, that they plan, 72% plan on increasing that over the next few years. And a similar result with AI and ML. When you go to the industry breakdowns, you'll see that change a bit, that this is generalized. Next. So now bear in mind that this research was done at the close of a full year, first year of the pandemic. The top 3 ways that enterprise open source is being used: IT infrastructure modernization was the clear first, application development and digital transformation nearly tied for second and third. The thing that's important and notable in the shift here is that at the beginning of last year, there was a concern that many companies might abandon their digital transformation initiatives as they were concerned about how the pandemic might affect their company and their employees. But we found instead with other related research that companies actually accelerated their digital transformation initiatives and also markedly increased their investment in modernizing their infrastructure. And much of that was driven because many companies who had not had employees work remotely were suddenly faced with the need to do that successfully and support their employees. So we saw a big increase in that space that we're pretty sure is driven in part by the pandemic. Next slide, please. Now, this was the kind of a surprise, not a surprise to me, but I was really heartened to see it. And that is that 87% the enterprise open source is more secure or as secure as proprietary software. I could add my own theory in behind this. I think this comes from more adoption and less direct experience rather than the traditional FUD that was promulgated for years around open source being less secure. Also things like high profile security breaches like SolarWinds, which was a proprietary implementation, probably haven't hurt to make a case that proprietary is not inherently more secure. And in fact, we're experiencing more security with open source. Next slide, please. Detail on cloud infrastructure. 69% prefer to use multiple cloud vendors for their infrastructure needs. Next slide. And this is another number that I was happy to see. 83% are more likely to select a vendor who contributes to the open source community. I was surprised, but not entirely surprised. I just find it incredibly encouraging as a longtime advocate of open source and with someone who has open source in their title. I'm glad to see that customers see the value. I'll come back and touch on that in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. So I'm just gonna hit the top level highlights on a couple of industries. I thought it would be fun. Yeah, let's go to the first one. First one is telecommunications. Telecommunications open source is really pervasive, 95% adopting. And then in a slide that is almost too small for me to read myself, you can also see that they're pretty aggressive in terms of use for AI and ML. Next slide, please.
Retail.
All right, retail, thank you, retail. So retail is also using a lot of open source, a little bit more conservatively, but you'll see that they're looking more at the ML capabilities and AI, and you can imagine with e-commerce and the complexity of the supply chain for retailers, you can see why that would be a benefit. Again, lots of detail in the report you're welcome to go look at. Next slide is financial services. Now, financial services, which is, you think of traditionally as a very conservative industry, in fact, has one of the highest rates of adoption of open source around. And I think part of this is due to the fact that they learned many years ago that they don't compete on infrastructure with their competitors in the financial services industry. They've actually been collaborating for quite some time. And I think we have one more, and that is healthcare. Healthcare, a little bit slower uptake. That's usually true. The healthcare industry has a legacy of very large and complex proprietary systems that predominate in an environment that it has a little room for error, so to speak. You will see, though, that they are very interested in IoT and edge, and I would credit that to the number of medical devices out there increasingly, where at the patient point of care, there is a device or 5 or 6. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go back because I cannot miss an opportunity to briefly reflect on the statistic about vendors prefer, customers prefer vendors who contribute to the open source community. And you can go to the next slide. And this is what I would say is based on qualitative research. And of course, you can just sort of flip through to go to reveal these all the way through to economic benefit. And this is a way to look at this, whether you're a developer or a company. And this Red Hat Inclusive, we participate in communities because they help keep our product line stable. When we're working in communities, we understand how it works. We've helped make it so we can support it. It's also a tremendous source of innovation. I think you saw that in Chris's presentation as well. From the developer's point of view, there's a lot of creativity in open source. Also, faster go-to-market, faster cadences than a proprietary approach would be. And then you can amortize the investment across many stakeholders. So you get a big lift for everybody. Next slide. And then this is our expense. Part of the responsibility for my open source program office is to help Red Hat customers at the request of our folks in the field, our sales engineers, our account representatives and customers who are deeply interested in participating more in open source communities. So this may be helpful for you as a developer or a business owner to think about how customers think about working along with you in open source communities. Having direct conversation with developers is a huge benefit that you find is unique to open source. Also being able to co-develop infrastructure on some of these leading edge projects like network function virtualization, edge and IoT are a couple of examples there. For our customers, getting early access to our technology roadmap is part of the benefit in working upstream. They can see what we're actually working on and work with us before we even publicly talk about where we're headed. And then it also gives them the benefit of early testing and prototypes, so they can kind of kick the tires of the rolling version of an application or a tool before it actually shows downstream and into a Red Hat supported distribution. So it's a model that really works for customers for them to all participate. And I underscore these points because I will never cease to seize the opportunity to advocate for more corporate company organizational participation in open source. It makes for stronger ecosystems. And I believe that is the end of my stump speech. You want to go to the next slide? Thank you very much. And I think we'll now open for Q&A. If you have anything any questions, you'd like to do that. And if you don't, then I'm going to ask Chris a couple of questions while you think about it. We have about 13 minutes left in our session. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in. I do have a question for you, Chris. And I was really fascinated by the deep dive you did on tool set and training and skills and the impact it has on a developer and
Yep.
how hiring managers see that. Did you get any information on where they're acquiring their skills from? Is that formal education? Or?
No, we actually didn't, but that's a great question. And that's one of the reasons that we put together the cloud guide, was to sort of provide developers with that. I think a lot of them, though, are getting it from, whether it's IBM or Red Hat, or for that matter, Google or Microsoft and so forth. All of them have, a developer, pages that are oriented towards developers.
Sure.
Where they have a lot of that material. But we felt, sort of pulling it all together and providing a sort of an experience that was both informative and educational, but also that was open source, so that could be improved upon, added to, and so forth. We thought that was something worthwhile doing.
That makes a tremendous amount of sense, and I appreciate you've done that. It's been about a decade since I worked in open source in academia, and there was really limited curriculum at the time. That's really changed, but I don't think that all of the skills are coming from the universities. I'm always interested in what the gap is to advocate for that. But I also know that not having those skills is a real barrier for underrepresented communities.
Yeah.
And so I'm always scouting for ways. I think that's a great example of a way we can give back and make a more inclusive environment by pointing people to the skills they may need. Because we've talked about this a few times, but yes, you can gain skills working in community and developing a reputation that way. But at the same time, you have to have the luxury of free time. So
yeah,
it's an interesting topic.
Yes, very much so. And we are trying to sort of get to sort of the college age, as well as sort of late high school age folk with at least with IBM's developer outreach, to try and penetrate into those dimensions, because they don't have a whole lot of open source training. I think they do, they do get into some of the details of databases and so forth, but they aren't really into okay, so how do you actually engage with the community? We've delivered a number of what we call dojos to some of our university outreach programs that have been very successful. And they also keep people engaged. We also have, there's a number of courses on something we call the IBM Skills Network, that is oriented around a lot of these same set of capabilities, and many of those courses are linked from the cloud guide. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah,
well,
so
I should mention.
I wanted to touch briefly on the point that you were making about customers looking for vendors that contribute to open source, and I will tell you that certainly in my experience, I got pulled into countless number of customer visits with potential clients who were wanting to know, so what does IBM do in open source, right? It seems like it's always a mystery to people that IBM does open source, because I think certainly of IBM's sort of longer term customers think of us from a mainframe perspective, but we've been doing open source for a long time. And I think they're all very surprised at just how much we are engaged in the upstream communities around, especially around the technologies that power our cloud and data and AI capabilities. And so all the time I'm being asked, how much do we contribute to Kubernetes or to OpenStack or Cloud Foundry or what have you? They all want to know just how much are we contributing. And I think they're often very surprised that we are.
Well, so much of it is published also. People can self-explore and see who's contributing.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Let me read it here. Of the various metrics and results you presented, which have you found to be the most compelling in conversation with your various organizational stakeholders? Maybe to put another way, how do these research projects furnish data that allow you to communicate the value of open source differently to different people with different goals and agendas inside an organization? Do you want to take a crack at that, and then I'll follow up?
Sure. I would say, let's see, probably the most compelling was that I spent a little bit extra time high centering on, which was how important it was to these large customers to have a company actually participate in open source. And I wish there was more data from the research itself, but it has been a great way to have continued conversation with customers. Every time we work with a customer who's interested in engaging or understanding the benefits that we derive from participating, and some have to be assumed, right? Because they already think it's good. Leads us to another conversation where we ask our customers what benefit they think they'd actually derive from participating. And those, we've learned a lot about different motivations for customers engaging and putting open source on their own technology roadmap. And how they are engaged and where they participate really depends on answering that question. You'd be amazed how many companies don't stop to think about that first, or they assume it. That key opens up how you should participate and who else you should be talking to in your company about it and how you map it. So I think that's been, asking those questions around the assumption of why they would benefit has opened the door to a lot of really meaningful conversations we've had with different goals and agendas.
Yeah, and I would put it so every chance that I get when I do, whether I do a presentation or whether I'm engaging with clients, is to talk about the benefits of contributing upstream, even if you're a consumer of the technology and you're not building, your own cloud infrastructure or what have you as a product offering, but you're leveraging vendor-provided Kubernetes or such as OpenShift, and the value of contributing upstream into those projects that are relevant is immeasurable. But I think, the results of certainly the survey that we did earlier this year does help me impress upon sort of consumers of, our typical clients to understand that even though, you've got people that are, sort of keeping, the software running in your organization, enabling them to contribute upstream into those projects actually is a benefit to you, because number one, it's what developers want to be able to do. And so in order to retain them, you have to, there needs to be a little bit of a give to get, so to speak. So enabling your developers to work in open source can be a benefit, if you will, to those developers that you can offer. And you'll find that you have happier developers and they're more likely to stick around. Because they will go someplace that does offer them that opportunity. And so if you don't, they may not be coming your way, right? So, and Deb, you and I have done a number of roadshows with a number of IBM and Red Hat clients over the course of the past year. And almost in every one, we talked about this and the benefits of contributing upstream. And I think both our studies contribute to that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? That has been true forever, that having open source projects in your company's portfolio is going to attract developers that are curious and have skills. I think it's becoming more and more critical to companies. But I remember 15 years ago, the state director of the data center in the state of Oregon, I asked him why it was he was running an open source application. And his answer was, I just want to attract good talent to my organization. And I know if I'm doing open source projects, we'll get interesting folks in. And I thought that was pretty revolutionary at the time, but it's been persistent. Well, we're about at the end of our time. I want to make sure the audience knows that both of these presentations will be shared by the conference organization. They include links for the original research and links to the body of information Chris mentioned for Dell developers I'll also mention that if you're interested, and you can, ask me on Twitter, wherever you can find me. Red Hat also produces a resource library and all kinds of topics on open source. So if you're looking for more information on how to help your organization better adopt open source, or if you're just trying to figure out the perfect governance structure for your brand new project, we have information to share there as well. So there you go. Chris, thanks so much for helping put this together. It was great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Always a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.